Who killed Gwen Stacy? Gwen Stacy is a character who had a remarkable transformative effect on both Spider-Man and the entire comic industry. Whatever opinions people hold on the character herself, one thing everyone agrees on, however, is that she is defined more by her death than her entire life. Certainly there are more conversations about her death. In this video, I will examine The Night Gwen Stacy Died, the most famous and widely considered best Spider-Man story of all time, and answer the question, who or what is responsible for Gwendolyn's demise? The story was written by Jerry Conway when he was 19 years old. The story opens with Harry Osborn attended by a doctor at his father's home as a result of his ongoing drug addiction. Gwen and Mary Jane are at his bedside. As Peter moves to join them, he is grabbed by an enraged Norman Osborn who blames him for his son's condition. Peter worries that he's starting to recover from his amnesia and will recall his secret identity. Norman shoots Peter and the girls out and takes a phone call. He learns his company's stock has significantly dropped before Harry enters the room and collapses unconscious. After Peter visits the Bugle, Norman mules over his son's condition, paranoid, considering them both surrounded by enemies. Norman arrives at his office only to be tormented by a delusion of Spider-Man. In frustration, he directs all of his hatred at the figure, and his memory surges back. Running to one of his bases, he puts on his costume, resolved that Peter Parker must die, die, die. The Green Goblin arrives at Peter's apartment and, spotting her there, abducts Gwen. Peter arrives and finds a note. Arriving at the bridge, Norman orders him to give up or he'll kill the unconscious Miss Stacy. Spider-Man goes into a fairly successful offensive, but Norman manages to knock her off the bridge with his glider. Spider-Man hits her leg with a web line, but the whiplash snaps her neck. Pulling her up, he congratulates himself on the save as he holds her in his arms and realizes what happened. This tragedy is all the more poignant because Gwen's father had died a while back. A police captain, he had revealed to Spider-Man his knowledge of his secret identity and told him to take care of Gwen. He failed to fulfill the dying man's wish. Grief naturally takes form and starts with denial. No, oh no, no, don't be dead, Gwen. I don't want you to be dead. I saved you, honey. Don't you see? I saved you. At this point, Norman decides to gloat. Romantic idiot. She was dead before your webbing even reached her. A fall from that height would kill anyone, before they struck the ground. But for you, dear friend, death will come even more swiftly than a sudden fall. Denial turns to anger. Wrong, Goblin. You're the creep who's going to pay. I'm going to get you, Goblin. I'm going to destroy you slowly. And when you start begging for me to end it, I'm going to remind you of one thing. You killed a woman I love, and for that you're going to die. Spider-Man fights, but his enemy gets away. He reaches the police as they find the body. He briefly enters denial again as he remembers their time together before the guilt sets in. A fascinating thing about the story is that Peter naturally feels guilty about what happens. It's a blow, even worse than the loss of his uncle, but he can't live with that guilt, anger, self-loathing. He must dispose of it, and so he chooses to project those feelings onto a very deserving target. This makes the story all the more profound since Spider-Man is all about responsibility, and his arch-enemy Norman is a man pathologically incapable of facing and accepting responsibility or blame for any of the problems in his life, performing all sorts of mental gymnastics to absolve himself. Thus, as the story plays out, Peter seeks revenge and nearly goes down the path of his foe. In other words, the Joker almost corrupts Batman because all it takes is one bad day to turn someone into a monster. Peter escapes the police and heads to Norman's house, determined to rid the world of a green-garbed monster. His spider sense not tingling, he determines it's just Harry here, and he blames them, slightly, for the turn of events. Harry is still sick, deluded, and miserable from the LSD, and Peter pities him. Harry begs him to stay and follows him as he starts to leave, but Peter prioritizes revenge over mercy. Somewhat justifiable, since on a good day, Norman could spill his identity at any moment. Spider-Man visits the Bugle for information to no avail, then finds him at one of his hideouts and simply mops the floor with him. And the Green Goblin just doesn't know when to shut up. Life? You talk to me about life? What worth is there to the paltry existence of one useless female? A simpering, pointless girl who never did more than occupy space, while Norman is just begging for it. Ultimately, on a subconscious level, he knows that Peter is responsible for his suffering, and that it was him who ruined Harry's youth, made unwise business decisions, and presumably beat his own wife to death years ago. But while Peter freely wallows in his guilt, only Norman's subconscious can, and so on an unconscious level he cowardly attempts to commit suicide by Spider-Man. He's interrupted by another pounding, but Peter stops himself before killing, realizing how close he's come to sinking. He says he's going to send him to jail, a big risk, of course, because of the danger of loose lips. But the Goblin sets his glider to impale Spider-Man from behind. It backfires, and so the proud men die, crucified not on a cross of gold, but on a stake of humble tin. Peter's rage evaporates as he realizes how ultimately meaningless the death was, not knowing that Harry had followed him and saw what happened. His decision of revenge over friendship will come back to bite him many times over the years as Harry falls into the path of darkness. Peter arrives at his apartment to find Mary Jane there. She's heard what happened, and in light of the later revelations, knew exactly what had happened and he was going through. Hey, Petey, I heard about Gwen. I'm really torn up. You torn up? Tears are clearly in her eyes. Don't make me laugh, Mary Jane. You wouldn't be sorry if your own mother died. What do you care about people like me and Gwen? This is particularly offensive because though Peter didn't know it, her mother had died a few years back, though, and her funeral had been a deciding turning point for her, though he had no knowledge of this. But he's not done yet. Go on, get out of here. I know how you hate sick beds, and believe me, I wouldn't want to spoil your fun. For a moment she hesitates by the door, but then she closes it while still inside, deciding to comfort him through the night. And this is how the story ends. Later she would recount that this was the moment that she realized her love for him. Rather than running away, as is her natural instinct when things get serious, for the first time in her life she chose love, and reveals that there is much more to her than the party girl of facade. Although we are still over a decade away from seeing it fully crumble at this point in continuity. Although it would be after 2 years of grieving that they shared their first kiss, their friendship grew very strong indeed. So what do we take from this? The Night Gwen Stacy Died was a fantastic story starring 5 characters: Peter Parker, Gwen Stacy, Norman Osborn, Harry Osborn, and Mary Jane Watson. Everyone in this story was a victim, and all their dynamics changed in ways that would define decades of continuity. Peter lost his first love. Gwen died, seemingly dead. Norman suffered a severe wound and left the country for a long time. MJ lost her best friend, and with Harry crazy and Flash fighting overseas, she was running low on excuses to avoid her home life. And Harry is abandoned by his friends and starts a dark journey to madness. This story was also great because it presented a fine moral dilemma. Peter had tried to atone for the death of his uncle by living according to the mantra, with great power there must also come great responsibility, never letting another person suffer because he failed to act. Yet it was his attempts to do so as Spider-Man that made the death of his beloved possible. No situation before this had given him as much motivation to quit, to conceal his identity, or be a loner. Furthermore, one of the major themes driving the series is the question of whether in a life of anonymous heroism and self-sacrifice, is it possible to have friendships, a spouse, family, etc., and this was greatly dramatized and amplified. But now it's time to examine the question of who killed Gwen Stacy. Peter feels very guilty for what happened because it was his webbing that caused her neck to snap. But even Norman says that Peter is not to blame, although his notion that she died before landing was dubious at best. The woman was gracefully sedated. Even if she had survived plopping into the water, she would have never drowned. It was a rookie mistake. We learned later, however, that he learned and obsessed over it, saving falling people time and time again, even when the Goblin tossed his wife off of the very same bridge. Of course, we do blame the Goblin. He does bear guilt for this, but while Peter may be excused from his webbing, there are other ways he could assume part of the blame. First was the very cavalier way he took to the offensive in fighting the Goblin. Norman had essentially said, "Let me kill you, or I'll kill your love in front of you." Not a very bright prospect for Peter to surrender. Being the young, naive Silver Age hero he is, Peter decides to take the third option, and her death entirely subverts it. As Norman put it in the first Raimi movie, this is why only fools choose to be heroes, because you never know when some lunatic will come around and give you a sadistic choice. The sadistic choice is a trope as old as the genre itself. A villain would present two terrible possibilities, urging the hero to choose between them. The hero would take the third option, and by sheer heroic ingenuity be able to save both people, things, planets, whatever. Raised on these inspiring tales, Spider-Man was confident he would succeed, and all the more crushed as he clutched her lifeless body and found it dead. There is, however, another reason. Looking back across the years, this story bears a tragic irony. Just as profound as Peter's failed attempts to save her actually killed her, and it's this. Their entire relationship on both sides was both a sham and a failure, and Gwen was actually wrong to defend him to her friends who'd accused Peter of cowardice, and that they ultimately didn't deserve each other. This whole turn of events could have been avoided if he had told her his secret identity. See, before Harry first started taking drugs, Peter and Gwen were having relationship troubles, shortly before and especially after her father's death. In this interval, it was clear that Peter had to tell her his secret. It was even hinted she suspected. She told him that her feelings for him were even stronger than her hatred of Spider-Man, a hatred that arose surrounding him being present at her father's death, very similar to a prior dilemma with Betty Brant. Peter knew this problem and fully acknowledged it, but he chickened out again and again and again, even when he was considering proposing. So she left for London. Long after her death, we learned she was pregnant with twins from Norman Osborn. At that time, the sex in question occurring during a moment of mutual weakness, days after Peter's second date with her. So it comes into question whether Norman might have been partially motivated to take her out of the equation so that he could hold exclusive claim to the children she bore in Europe. Regardless, while Gwen might very well have truly loved Peter, she actively concealed her pregnancy in indiscretion, believing that she could get married to him and raise the children together. In other words, he could have just been used very thoroughly. Regardless, Stan's thought bubbles when she's in London indicate that his failure to propose was the motive for her leaving. Whatever people may think of Sin's past, it does add a layer of dimensionality to a very flat character, resulting in the very hormonal behavior in her stories making a lot more sense, changing her from a sweet but slightly spoiled girl who cries at the first sign of trouble to a woman dealing with some very serious challenges. It was later revealed that MJ knew her situation and kept it secret, when she could have used it at any time to split the girl from the object of her affection. In a different flashback, it was also shown that days after her father's death, Gwen nearly gave up on Peter, but MJ encouraged her to patch things up, a decision she remains proud of, having enabled them to continue sharing their lives together, if only for a little while. Anyway, Peter's cowardice resulted in Gwen's departure. Gwen's departure resulted in Mary Jane putting the moves on Peter. Harry, misunderstanding the casual nature of his relationship with Mary Jane, reacted by getting LSD, furthering his prior addiction. His behavior and the observations made to his father before hospitalization partly resulted in him becoming a goblin again. This addiction persisted, and months later, after Gwen's return, he got sick again. Cue the night Gwen Stacy died. This simple lesson, if you're a superhero, it's irresponsible not to let your significant other know, is something Peter has yet to learn, as is evidenced by his failure to tell Carly Cooper before she found out on her own. His committed a relationship with Mary Jane was only possible because after years of being lied to, she lost her patience and let him have it. Now, should we place some blame on Peter for not telling Gwen, MJ for flirting with him in front of Harry, or Harry for becoming an addict? Or was there a factor we weren't even aware of? This is merely a theory, mind you, but Norman Osborn is the grand architect of 80% of Peter's suffering over the years, operating for the 5 years after this event from behind the scenes. In the narration between Norman remembering and him donning the costume, it says he acts as if ridden by a demon, and in the 90s, Norman was the leader of the Scryer cult, who worshipped a being by the same name, who the writers originally intended to be Mephisto all along. Also, the word goblin itself means demon, and when Brand New Day was being developed, one of the early scrapped ideas was that the change that prevented the marriage from happening was Harry getting early rehab for his drug addiction, which would have prevented Gwen's death. That being a change Mephisto could have made strongly suggest he had an involvement in said addiction. Perhaps Night Gwen Stacy Died was one of his early attempts to corrupt the hero, and the first and sadly not last time he ruined his love life. This is just wild speculation, of course, and in the end, my friends, it's up to you to judge. The point is that the death of Gwen Stacy came as a surprise for many, but it was years in the making. One could argue it was fated to happen as early as Amazing Spider-Man number 31 through 33, 39, 40, or 42. Certainly it was sealed years before with number 98. Whatever Gwen's true feelings were, however, there's one thing we can be sure of. She loved Spider-Man without ever knowing it. That's right, although she only ever knew the half Peter let himself show her, in thinking about her attraction to him early on she noted that, no matter what the others say, there is something so strong, so proud about Peter Parker. In other words, while she might not have known the whole truth about him, as Mary Jane was aware from the start, like MJ, she loved the Spider as well, and more importantly, the overlap, his soul, the very core of his character, and that's something to think about. One of the writers. Many people across the decades have felt bitter or conflicted towards Conway. Modern writers like Dan Slott even expressed his saying that Mary Jane was what pushed Gwen off the bridge. Conway has always expressed his preference, firmly believing that one character was an ultimate fantasy, the other an ultimate reality, never showing one molecule of regret. But the decision to kill Gwen was made 2 years earlier, before Conway even started writing. Spider-Man artist John Romita Sr. wanted a character to be killed. He thought Aunt May was the perfect candidate, but at that time, it had been explicitly stated the only reason Peter kept a secret identity was to shield his aunt from a possible heart attack. Stan wouldn't let that happen, so as Stan ended his run and realized that although he had made some progress in the past year, the relationship was becoming something of a problem, he told Conway that if he couldn't either mature or change the economic status of Peter fast enough, or make great stories with the relationship, he was to kill Gwen. Conway did try his best, and the annuals and what-ifs he later wrote proved that he bore no malice, even introducing her doppelganger in the original Clone Saga. The Green Goblin had also been a problem because there were only so many times you could have a villain knowing your secret identity suffer amnesia. Here's how he put it in an interview after penning Parallel Lives. Only a damaged person would end up with a damaged guy like Peter Parker, and Gwen Stacy was perfect. It was basically Stan fulfilling Stan's own fantasy. Stan married a woman who was pretty much a babe. Joan Lee, that's Stan's wife, was a very attractive blonde who was obviously Stan's ideal female. And I think Gwen was simply Stan replicating his wife, and that's where his blind spot was. Stan Lee had this to say on the matter. We just tossed MJ into the series to liven things up, as competition for Gwen. However, Gorgeous Gwen was a star, the one we structured our stories around so that Peter could end up marrying her. But we couldn't make it work. It was like something out of the Twilight Zone. These were fictional characters, or so we had always thought. I had created them. I could mold them in any manner I desired. I could make them do whatever I wanted. Or could I? MJ sees a dominant role in our strip, just as powerfully as if she were human. Having once established her character, we couldn't violate what we had already set up. She was colorful and appealing from the start. No matter how I later tried to play her down, make her subordinate to Gwen Stacy, I couldn't do it. MJ always outshone Gwen. If it were a Broadway show, MJ would have been the one who always grabbed center stage and held it. So, in summary, Gwen died to create the greatest Spider-Man story of all time, to fuel decades of plot developments and character arcs, to pass the villain torch from father to son, to introduce a level of tragedy and dramatic realism that hadn't yet existed in comics, to establish Peter and Mary Jane as a couple, and to give the hero another reason to protect his identity so that Aunt May would be free to pass away in the future. Without Gwen's death, the Clone Saga would have never happened, the Jackal wouldn't have existed, the Hobgoblin wouldn't have existed, Ben Reilly, Kane, Spider-Side, Gwen's clones, and Jackal's clones wouldn't exist, Black Cat wouldn't exist, Carrion wouldn't exist, the Stacy twins wouldn't exist, the Punisher wouldn't exist. Norman Osborn wouldn't have been wounded and would continue to operate in the open. Who knows what would have happened? Harry's life would have been better and worse. He would have never become the second Green Goblin, but he also wouldn't have ended up with Liz, who he married and had a child with. Bart Hamilton wouldn't have become the third Green Goblin. If Black Hat did exist, and he were in a situation to date her, he would be far less interested. Peter and Gwen would have entered a marriage that would have taken a fraction as much time and effort to eliminate as the one he had with Mary Jane. We would never have seen beyond the party girl facade. MJ wouldn't have had the chance to develop. The spider marriage wouldn't have happened along with every tale that was told during over 20 years of storytelling, including Sin's Past, Craven's Last Hunt, and Marvel Knight's Spider-Man. MJ would never have gotten pregnant with Peter's kid, and hence Spider-Girl would never have existed. An early Deadpool story would never have happened. Liz Allen would have never returned to the supporting cast. We would never have found out that Molten Man was Liz's stepbrother. Spider-Man would have had a considerably better reputation among New York's finest. And that is just scratching the surface. When you really look at it, can you say that any comic book death not tied to an origin story has accomplished so much? Gwen wasn't some woman in a refrigerator, a woman disposed of, often horrifically killed in order to give some short-term motivation or development to a male protagonist. While it's true that most of the examples of this trope were inspired by the story, Gwen was the opposite of a woman in a refrigerator. Unlike every single love interest, no thought of disposability went into her when she was created, and despite having every narrative edge possible, she failed and was given a Shakespearean exit. The trope of women in refrigerators is another example of people trying to replicate success without understanding what made something successful. What made the death of Gwen Stacy so powerful 45 years ago was that it was groundbreaking. It had never been done before, and that goes for many other aspects of the Spider-Man story. Decades later, a much more vibrant version of Miss Stacy was created to grace the silver screen in The Amazing Spider-Man 1 and 2. I loved both movies tremendously and would scarcely change a thing about them. But I was bummed out by the time The Amazing Spider-Man 2 ended. Not because Emma's character had died, but how she lived. By cutting out MJ's scenes when the character was so important to his grieving process, letting Gwen know he was Spider-Man throughout the relationship in the films, and by replicating so many aspects of a different relationship. Stone's Gwen was ultimate MJ with Gwen's background. It destroyed the entire romantic arc of the Spider-Man mythology. Rather than capturing a vital part of it, you're left with the conflicts between love and duty resolved as the two are incompatible, rather than that you can find a balance and have them both. Nevertheless, it was a fantastic film, and I'm sure many fans are happy to have lived long enough to see that story echoed as an entire generation got to feel this moment as they experienced the snap heard round the world. Next time, web slingers, in I Am the Spider, we'll scratch the surface of some of the deep psychological and mythic work of J.M. DeMatteis and JMS. Until then, don't forget to like and subscribe. You can donate if you are so inclined. Make sure to leave your thoughts in the comments and any requests you may have. Until then, Excelsior.